Russ Ellis is now an emeriti professor of architecture, and he stepped down before he retired. He was serving as Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs here at UC Berkeley. He has a long and distinguished history here at Berkeley in architecture, where he focused on social factors and the sociology of the architecture profession. And one of his books, which has really become a standard in the field, is called Architects' People. And it's really about how architects work and the forces that affect their everyday practice and the outcomes of their work. Russ is here to guide a panel that has a very distinguished emeriti faculty on it. And I want to turn the panel over to Russ now to begin our discussion. Russ.
Thank you, Dean Walsh. And good morning. It's early on a Saturday, and I'm going to violate my panel. I did warn them a little bit that I'm not going to do the ordinary introduction. Take a look at your program, and let me just tell you in advance, if you're aware of any of the professional organizations in the field of environmental planning, landscape architecture, so our panel's headed up, gotten awards, been important in every single one of them. This is big time. I asked Joe Esherick once, Joe, if there is such a thing for you, what is the most important thing in an architectural job? And he did not hesitate. He said, learning what I'm going to have to know in order to do the job. Well, some people say, that's what an education is, learning what you're supposed to know and where to go get it. Not so much getting the knowing, but knowing how to get the knowing. Well, let me just say, if you study the life and work of the three panelists, you'll have an education in environmental design. They do cover just the widest spectrum of practices and knowledge and innovations. And that's who Claire Cooper Marcus, Michael Teese, and Sim Vanderen are. I asked them online to give me a title for their talks, and Claire said it would be Teaching Social Factors in CED, my experience, following the colon. Michael said T.J. Kent and the Transformation of Planning and Planning Education. And Sim said, Connecting Design to the Flows of People and Space. We'll hear from each of the panelists. They have sworn not to cross their legs, look at the ceiling, and reminisce. And whatever they do, they will do inside 10 minutes. And after which time, they will talk to each other. Hopefully unmediated. If they do cross their eyes or legs and reminisce, I will stop them. And they'll do that for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and maybe a few speeches from you out there, but try to distinguish your questions from your speeches. But it'd be nice to get us going and have the interchange. So we'll go in the order listed in the panel, and we'll start with Claire Cooper Marcus. What a hug.
Oh. Hey. Okay, so this is going to be a fairly personal, from my point of view, teaching in CED. Unlike any of the other panelists, I think, I entered here as a student. I came here in 1961 at the urging of Don Foley, professor of city planning, who I'd met in London. And this was a period when modernist architecture was under fire. And we, class of 1964 or whatever we were in city and regional planning, we were a pretty feisty group of students. In fact, we went on strike at one point because we felt what we were being taught was not relevant, and we refused to go to class. It was a bit of a shock to the faculty. Thinking back to that time, one of my most inspiring educational experiences was a seminar led by late Professor Jesse Rychek, where we read the whole of The Death and Life of American Cities, which had just come out, Jane Jacobs' famous book. And each week we read one chapter and talked about it. And we were totally fired up. This was someone, not an academic, a journalist, critiquing modern architecture. We were very excited. 3 of us in that seminar subsequently became faculty members here. Myself, Sarah Ishikawa, and Ken Simmons. Across the country, often unknown to each other, social scientists and some enlightened designers, including Sim here, who we're going to hear from, began to do research and offer courses in an area that at the time had no name. It was variously called Environment and Behavior, Man, Environment Systems, People and the Physical Environment, Social Factors in Design. Caught up in this ferment, I went to a chair, an unnamed chair of a department in this college at the time, as a very feisty young, not yet academic, saying that we should have such a course in this college. And he replied, maybe one day we can afford such a luxury. To which, with youthful impertinence, I responded, I trust one day it will be seen as a necessity and not as a luxury. A few years later, I did start teaching, 1969. I started teaching a course in what we call social factors in landscape architecture. Little had been published at that time. I hardly knew anything, except I wanted to make some connection between design and people. I had very little to draw on except my Master of City Planning thesis, which had been a case study of a housing project here in Richmond, what was termed at the time a post-occupancy evaluation, a term we actually had to invent. My own background academically was in historical and cultural geography. So I sent out students to do what I knew how to do, which was field work. The first semester I taught, People's Park erupted in Berkeley. So the administration insisted they needed the site for a playing field. I didn't believe them. I sent the students out to document the use of existing playing fields, found half of them empty half the time, composed a letter to the chancellor and sent it off. There goes tenure, I thought to myself, though it didn't seem to make any difference. Somewhere in another class, I remember, they conducted a survey of residents around People's Park, and I well remember staying up the whole night with Roger Montgomery in Ramona's, documenting the results of that, saying that people did want to park there. When I began teaching, since I didn't know very much and there was very little published, I sent students out evaluating downtown plazas, how well they served their users, doing behavior mapping and interviews in neighborhood parks. And I always ended these assignments by having them redesign the place, because I wanted students to see the application of social material, and that I felt a lot of their practice would be actually redesigned. They wouldn't always be designing from scratch. From reading these student papers, I began to gain knowledge, much of which was then incorporated into subsequent lectures we learned together. And the research that they did informed a book that I wrote with my students called People Places. Somewhere in the 1970s, I added a new crucial assignment to all my classes after reading Bachelar's The Poetics of Space. This was an assignment I called an environmental autobiography. I took students on a guided meditation. Yes, this was the 70s. I had them close their eyes. I took them on a guided meditation to a favorite childhood place, which they then drew and described and then talked to each other about in class. They then wrote a paper about all the significant environments of their life. As I said to them, there's no reading involved, there's no research, there's no right or wrong, this is just your own memories. And I had them end this paper with reflecting on how have these environmental experiences affected your choice of profession, and do you see in your studios any repeated patterns, which some of them did, from childhood places. Just as psychologists need to undergo analysis so as not to dump their stuff onto their clients, I believe that designers need to uncover their own aesthetic preferences and biases, and that was what I was doing. Unbeknownst to me, interestingly, Randy Hester in North Carolina and Kenny Helfand in Oregon were offering similar assignments at the time. I've never forgotten the response of one student who came to my office for his paper. And when I gave it back, he said, "This is the first time in my university career anyone has indicated that my life is of any consequence." I could have wept at that. I have met former students who've told me this was the one paper they've never thrown away. This assignment is now offered in many design schools, and insights from the many papers I read led to the research which resulted in my book, The House is a Mirror of Self. Since retiring in 1994, I've occasionally returned to Worcester to teach a course in what is now my current passion, the design of healing gardens and therapeutic landscapes in healthcare, the whole fascinating area of links between nature and health. So finally, what has happened to this field, which had no particular name in the 1960s? It has mushroomed into a discipline of environmental psychology with its own peer-reviewed journals, PhD programs, and their graduate students teaching in some schools of architecture. The link between research and design, which we used to call user needs, is now termed evidence-based design, a much sexier term, and is essential knowledge in many architectural firms, especially those designing hospitals. Architecture firms, and some of them are employing environmental psychologists to do programming and research and to conduct post-occupancy evaluations. Today, the use of online surveys and observational studies using GIS are a far cry from the paper and pencil fieldwork we did in the 60s and 70s, pounding the streets and knocking on doors. There's been an explosion of new terms and approaches since 40 or even 20 years ago, terms such as walkability, livability, ecological consciousness, quality of life indicators, etc. Social problems not even considered 40 years ago, such as the rising rate of obesity, have spawned a raft of active living research with generous funding sources such as the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation, funding we could not have dreamed of in the 70s. Other approaches, many other innovations in this field, such as place attachment, sustainability as more than green buildings, neuroscience research, and the practice of design, and the proposal to create a National Academy of Environmental Design to coordinate research and provide expertise to committees of the National Research Council who advise Congress. In conclusion, one disheartening and one heartening trend. First, the bad news. As people like myself are retiring, have retired, gosh, it's 15 years ago now, in many places we are not being replaced. I think this is a big mistake. Soon after my retirement here, I challenged a faculty member in the architecture department on this issue. "Oh," he replied, "back in the 60s and 70s, we needed people like you to remind us about user needs in design, but now we all have a social conscience." To which I replied, "It's a lot more than having a social conscience. I could just as well say to you as an architect, we don't need to teach design studios anymore because we all have good taste." Architects still need to know about how to do research, evaluate, and apply it. A social conscience is not enough. Finally, the good news. Just on a personal note, I was recently hired along with a colleague, one of my former students in landscape, Marnie Barnes. We were hired by a landscape firm in Chicago to evaluate 6 hospital gardens they had installed. And just last week at the annual conference of the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects, we presented our findings, critiquing each place in terms of its pros and cons as a therapeutic setting. We looked at a children's hospital, acute care, Alzheimer's, long-term care, a heart hospital, and evaluated in terms of how well they served the therapeutic needs of those particular patients. The designer was willing to have this critique presented in front of his peers and then commented on how this study had changed his practice. We have come a long way from the 60s and 70s when, as academics, we devised the approach of post-occupancy evaluation to now when a designer, which is rare, requests and pays for such an evaluation and is willing to have it published and presented in front of his peers, even if it shows that he made some mistakes. And finally, just on a very small anecdote, I was recently living in the UK for a while, listening to a BBC program on sustainable school design. And I heard the term post-occupancy evaluation referred to, and the speaker apparently didn't need either to define the term or justify the approach. That is good news indeed. Thank you.
Good morning. I must say, after 3 hours in this room with the outgassing carpets last night, I have a little bit of a headache. I hope that's not actually the carpets, but you never know. Today, I want to talk to you really a story about the intersection of institutional design and professional education in urban planning. I was thinking about Peter's talk last night, for those of you who were here, which was an amazing tour through the history of planning and its intersection with many other fields, ending in an inspiring agenda for us. But he didn't dwell long, he didn't dwell long on any period, on the period really 1950 to 1970, which is when the College of Environmental Design came into existence. A key person in that process was T.J. Kent, Jack Kent, who was the first chair of the planning department. And Kent, among all the other things he did, was very concerned about the nature of planning itself and the profession and its place in the US at that time. Let's think back for a minute. By the 1950s, professional planning in the US had reached sort of a plateau. There was the concept of the master plan, which in Kent's terms became the general plan, which followed essentially the 1928 Standard City Planning Act, which was a model act intended to encourage cities and to give them a model for planning. The centerpiece of that act was the Planning Commission, which was typically an appointed body with the responsibility of drawing up the plan. It was, in fact, an apolitical ideal, a holdover in many ways from the period of the turn of the century, from City Beautiful, and from the progressive movement, which was battling city political machines. There were already professional planners, although relatively few employed by cities. There were many consultants whose history, by and large, has not been written. I had a wonderful paper from a student in my history of city planning class a year or so back talking about this subject. I think there are some books, but it's underwritten. There were many places that didn't plan at all. And those that did, the plan itself was often violated. And of course, sitting next to the plan was zoning, which had an older history, and in many, and probably in most places, did not accord with the plan very well. Now, Kent was a younger planner with a vision. He was, in fact, the youngest director ever, and really, in all respects, technically he's the second director of planning in San Francisco, but in reality, I think he's the first. In 1949, he became the first chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning in the University of California. So clearly his activities and his energy had attracted attention before that time. I'll come back to the department in a moment. He was possessed, I think, of a larger vision, which was partly expressed in the work of Telesis, about which we heard a little last night, and in what became the Greenbelt Alliance, and now People for Open Space, his long-held effort to create a greenbelt in the Bay Area. But he was also very concerned about the character of planning itself. In the late 1950s, he was writing a book. It's called The Urban General Plan. And I think that, well, never mind. No slides, sorry. The interesting thing is he didn't publish the book until 1964. And one may wonder about that. But essentially, what Jack Kent was concerned about was the nature of planning as it had evolved at the time. In the book, there's a section called 1930 to 1950, 20 Years of Confusion. And I think people don't, when they think of the Urban General Plan, they don't think much about that section. But actually, it's a devastating critique of the way planning was at the time. He saw planning as having had a great start with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Alfred Bettman, who was responsible for much of the legal structure of planning in the early part of the century. But he also saw there were immense problems. There was confusion between zoning and general planning. There was piecemeal adoption of plans, poor definition of the essential nature, the essential pieces, the elements, as he came to call them, of plans. There were issues of scope. Where did the plan begin, end? And especially, the thing that I think concerned Kent the most was the mistrust of the legislative body as a planning entity. He set out in his book to remedy this, beginning, I think, by changing the nomenclature to the general plan rather than the master plan. I may be wrong about this, and I'm actually researching some of this now, so this is kind of a dry run on a more extensive piece. As we look at the following decades, Kent was remarkably successful or prescient or both. The general plan nomenclature was widely adopted. We have a clear distinction with zoning, and we've had cases that force zoning into conformity with the general plan. Most importantly, the general plan elements became part of California law, and every general plan now has elements, and the elements get added to. So this is creativity, I think, of a high order. But above all, I think what Kent, were he alive today, would be pleased about and concerned about is the gulf between the planning and the political structure of the city. What we see today is a great narrowing, a of that gulf, that city councils play a major role in planning, and it's expected, it's normal, especially if you live in Berkeley or San Francisco. Kent helped that by being elected to the Berkeley City Council, and I think that Fred Collignon followed in his tradition. Simultaneously, if I could take just, how am I doing, Russ? 5 minutes? Okay. Sorry, what did you say? I can't hear. It's very, very fortunate.
Move on.
Okay, move on, right. Okay. Simultaneously, Kent was creating a new planning department. Planning had been around since 1918, but embedded in landscape architecture. But the new department was very radical. It was freestanding. I remember becoming chair and finding these memos addressed from the president, addressed to Dean, Professor T.J. Kent. It's wonderful. No dean. No disrespect, ma'am. But I think he had a cool situation. He had a lot of resources, and they were coming fast. The department was identified as an element for expansion under the UC master plan, which is, you can find it if you read it. Jack understood that the basis of intellectual discourse in the field was changing dramatically, as Peter mentioned last night. He saw the advance of the social sciences, but held to the belief that planning's main role was to guide the city's physical development. Thus, the curriculum of the DCRP was actually very traditional at the time I arrived in 1963 and when Claire was a student. Basically, there were 4 huge studios taking most of the time for 4 semesters. I won't go into details. The field, however, was changing very fast. Mel Weber understood that, and he put in place major changes, which I think would have happened anyway. DCRP was intended to become part of CED and to merge into the CED idea, but it actually changed faster than was possible for it to merge in its old form. And I think that's very important. What emerged out of the debates was a new curricular structure with 3 options: physical planning, housing, and what was then called urban systems, which Peter referred to last night. There were courses in quantitative methods. There was huge debate in the department about what we should be doing. And meanwhile, the university was exploding in all directions. We had FSM and the rest of it. So I think that Jack Kent's vision of DCRP, in contrast to his vision of planning, was very different from what had emerged. And yet, paradoxically, when I look at the curriculum and the program now, much of that seems to have been absorbed. Much of that innovation seems to have been absorbed into a structure that we find in planning departments all over the country. And I think we were innovative in that respect. Just to round out, are there lessons here? First, vision rarely becomes reality, but we have to have vision in order to address change. Second, visions take a long time to materialize. The role of the legislature in planning is still evolving, but no one doubts it. I'm talking about the city legislature. Jack always saw the plan as the constitution of the city. Academic and professional visions are unlikely to be in sync. Each must innovate in its own realm and come to terms with the other as best it can. There are big problems when the academic vision takes off on its own, into its own realm of blah, 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 blah. But that may actually be necessary, all that craziness, for real innovation to occur. I remember people thought that Sim was pretty crazy in that early days there. The professional problem is likely to be the reverse, clinging to old ideas and approaches when they no longer work. But just consider the new urbanism, which is really a professionally based innovation, conceived, I think, largely within the profession. Finally, as then, we still face challenges, as Peter said last night. And the next challenge, the key challenge, is climate change. I think we are in a position to address it, but that's a long story that I could talk for another 45 minutes about. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and the future of connecting design to the ecology of people and place. And I just want to start with actually a memoriam that Jack Kent and Mel Weber wrote after Catherine Bauer Worcester's unfortunate death, although she died in her favorite places. Quote, "Her love of the mountains, the beaches, and the forests with which nature has so richly endowed the West heightened both her love for the city and her concern that its tawdry environment, built by men, not cloud the lives of those hundreds of millions born and raised in cities. It was the gap between the promise of American life and its reality, between the hope and the realization that commanded her attention, her energies, and her talents." Well, reading this tribute, I was reminded of a book edited by my friend Heather Boyer, called Life Stories, a 2000 UC Press book in which 16 world-renowned environmental scientists reflect on their lives and the future of the Earth. One theme that struck me, or the theme that struck me the most strongly about these essays, was that each began by tracing their love of science to early childhood experiences in nature, not school, just direct experiential learning. And I was just thinking about that. It'd be interesting to see if if the same would be true for this generation's or the last generation's renowned architects. Is their core? How many of their core? Of those people was their core experience with the living world. In the old arc of the early '60s, I felt shared, deep caring for nature and other living beings, including people. I believe the Worcesters were friends with the great Druid and my mentor, David Brower. Those gentle, knowing beings, Charles Moore, Joe Esherick, Garrett Ekbo, also brought to the school a love of nature's beauty and the architecture which celebrates the unique natural qualities of our region. The creation of CED, led by the Worcesters, envisioned transcending the boundaries between the design planning disciplines towards more comprehensive, holistic design education. Environmental design implies the integration of human ecology and natural ecology into the practice of designing built environments. I came to Berkeley, actually I came to Berkeley first in '58 when I moved to California, because I'm basically not an urban person. And I remember driving over here and meeting with Jack Kent, because I'd gone to the University of Michigan, and they said, you know, you should become a planner. And so I went to meet with Jack, who was very gracious and very kind, but I decided not to go to graduate school, instead do my apprenticeship as an architect. But then I came here to teach in '61, influenced by an early love and affinity for the natural world, for hands-on experience in building. Very inspired, what kept me in architecture school was meeting Bucky Fuller when he's peripatetically, you know, traveling around to schools. I was the guy that ran the slide projector from 8 in the evening till 3 in the morning. You know, I just loved his vision of carrying forward these bold thought experiments. And also, I had a curiosity about how design spaces actually affected people and how users could participate more directly in creating their own environments through collaboration, through collaborative and more open design processes. Well, in the open, non-ideological environment of CED in those early years, I was able to explore all those interests through my teaching and research. One of the first was developing early post-occupancy studies, the dorms at Berkeley, out of which the chancellor appointed me head of a committee called the Committee on Housing and Environment. And I remember the first meeting I chaired, the executive vice chancellor, Bud Chait, came and said, you know, we're going to tear down 4 blocks of around Telegraph to build, not a playing field, medical school. Well, I looked in the capital budget, there was no medical school in there. So our committee said, no, we can't approve this. You have no use for this. And, well, they did it anyway. And then when things got a little warm, the chancellor said, hey, you know, you got to do something about this. You got to convene your committee. You got to talk. You have to negotiate with the leaders. And I said, you don't understand. No, there are no leaders in the People's Park. Anyhow. Yeah, and actually it was through a grant. I got a grant from NIMH, a pretty large grant at the time, to study, I think it was called New Institutional Forms. People's Park was one of the things we were studying, so I kind of had a pretty good sense of what it was. And actually one of the things that did happen, you know, as it heated up and as Reagan was making noises, did get the CED faculty and to vote that People's Park would become a field station of the college. Well, Reagan, and I met with Reagan, he just laughed. He said, you know, you commie and anarchist buddies, you're out of here. I don't think I had, maybe I had tenure. I think I had tenure. So then from there also, well, actually before already, Sandy Hershen, who my old high school buddy from New York, he and I had an office, and then we were asked by this is when the federal government still cared about poor people, and set up the War on Poverty, and we developed models for migrant farm labor communities, 22 of which are built in California. We used the 106 space, and I remember Sergeant Shriver flew out here to see what we were up to start the program. And I remember Jim Pristini saying, you know, what do you have politicians coming into my shop for? You know, well, he's the brother-in-law of the president. You know, come on. So we did that. We were, and then I was able to combine all those interests in set up a course, because after People's Park, I kind of left Berkeley. It was, I had escaped Holland with my family the day the Nazis invaded, and I realized when I was writing my last book, which is kind of a work autobiography, that Berkeley, the day it was invaded, tear gas, helicopters, my kids were gassed in their schools, that was a flashback to leaving Holland. And I moved out of my house, my little mansion in the Claremont, above the Claremont, into cabin in Inverness with my family and kids. I didn't realize that was really the trauma. It was my trauma when I was 5 years old. Came back, and I told the department. I said, you know, I'm not going to teach on the campus anymore. Sorry. Well, I did. I think I took a leave because I got a Guggenheim Fellowship. When I came back to teach, I said I'm doing the class out in Inverness on a piece of wilderness land I had just bought, and we had a class called Making a Place in the Country. It was kind of a 70s experiment where 15 students came out 4 days a week. We foraged food. We went, we did buy rice, but we foraged about all the rest of our food. We built a little village out there. Every student had to build their own space. Everything was built out of recycled materials. We drive around with a flatbed truck, dumpster diving, and whatever else. I did come back. I said, "What?" They said, "You have to come back to campus now." Okay. So what we did is we had a year-long class. It's called where the first semester we researched all kinds of renewable energy systems. My really interest was that my interest has always been for 40 years that architecture is not, buildings are not objects, they're organisms. Cities are not, cities are ecosystems. And so the connection of, the basics of shelter and building to energy, to water, to waste, and to food, that's the design problem I've seen for the last 40 years. So we did this little experiment out here. Okay, speed it up. In the global economic boom of the last half century, the ethics and practices of the design professions and design education were severely challenged. The optimistic socialist vision of modernism degenerated in the cults of postmodernism, deconstructivism, and other forms of advanced design dementia. As one biologist mentor of mine once commented, we're burning down the house of life in order to toast marshmallows. Or as another mentor, Gregory Bateson once remarked, when we drive nature insane, we lose our own sanity. That's part of my craziness. Now another generation of designers is carrying the banner of green and sustainable design. The language, concepts, and practices are somewhat haphazardly finding their way into design education and practice. But the big question is whether slow incremental change in how we design and build can reverse the dangerous trends that now threaten all forms of life on Earth. What is meant by terms such as green and sustainable is far from transparent, and it's too often becomes an excuse not to address fundamental questions such as, is the proposed design, no matter how green or sustainable, quote unquote, the best solution to the problem? Has the real problem, the solution, even been identified? And we don't have time to talk about it, but one of the things that annoyed me immensely was, the building of the Merced campus with green buildings on one of the last sites with vernal pools in California, and putting this thing out on green fields then spawned the destruction of Hispanic communities around there, and of course is building another set of sprawl around. But oh yeah, but it's green. Modern culture has thrived through the development of our left brain capacity to reduce all problems to finite rational solution algorithms. Yet the design problems we face consist of multidimensional, complex systems issues that cross traditional disciplines and knowledge sets. We have to develop whole new mindsets, ways of working together, communicating across mindsets, and tossing away old habits and inventing new collaborative processes to overcome today's fragmented bunker mentality. And we all know academic institutions, yes, this vision of CED was we're going to tear down the bunkers. But it's a hard one to do. We need to shift our focus on left brain to right brain, which is the basis for all design. We need to shift our focus from interdisciplinary to metadisciplinary, which is, we all are sharing the same kind of worldview and an integrated whole systems approach. The 3 R's of design, as far as I'm concerned, for the 21st century are restoration, regeneration, and resiliency. This means integrating building design within a larger context of community design and the integral ecological design of food, water, energy, and recycling systems at every scale. Most of today's middle school students, particularly in Berkeley, know the mantra, materials cycles, energy flows, life webs. I'd like to see design students have that literally imprinted in their hearts and in their minds. Okay, we know, you know, sadly, corporate capitalism today controls our politics and our major institutions. Will the ruling system permit the fundamental changes necessary to save humankind? Or will a dysfunctional elite culture of denial, which rejects the value of nature's capital and the need for social and environmental equity, continue to make the rules? You know, we really have no choice but to create the change we can believe in. Because as much as I respect our president, but you know, there are 80,000 lobbyists in Washington, as my old research assistant Robert Reich is now in the Goldman School likes to say. When he went to Washington in '72, there were 1,000 lobbyists. Half of them represented organized labor. Now we have 80,000. 25,000 of those people represent the financial services, so-called financial reserve service industry. But I am hopeful, particularly about CED. Recently, I spent a delightful afternoon with Jennifer Walsh and her husband Michael out at my survivalist compound in Inverness. And I'm optimistic that her leadership and vision can bring new life, will bring new life and productive change to this college. These are difficult, trying times, as we all know, for the University of California, for our country and our planet. But sometimes necessity truly is the mother of innovation. And out of hope, out of pain, I hope we see rebirth. Thank you.
Claire, Michael, Sim, thank you so very much. Please come up. And while you're coming up, I want to tell a very quick story I've told before from this podium. Claude Stoller was coerced into being chair after Chuck Moore left. And he said that when he went into the office and opened Chuck's drawer, he found 3 years worth of unanswered first-class mail. What I think about that story is Chuck was highly focused. He knew what he wanted to do, and the things he didn't want to do, he didn't do. I just said to Jennifer about the current circumstance, highlighted by the major demonstration this weekend, that she's in a major dust storm. She's not daunted because she knows there's a lot you can accomplish in a dust storm, and I wish you well. When I came, it was after the dust storm, and I came in '70, and you were all suffering participation fatigue, I think. There was just so much that had gone on. And I was brought here, I think, pretty clearly by Roz Lindheim. Would you say something, as you get started, about her influence on this college? Maybe Claire could start.
Is that on? No? Is that on? Yes. Yes, I'm ashamed I didn't mention her. Gosh, so many people I could have mentioned. Roz Lindheim, for those of you... It's working, isn't it?
It's working.
Yeah, for those of you too young to remember, was a very distinguished professor of architecture here who specialized in the architecture of hospitals. And I suppose her mantra was, do we really need a hospital? She was always questioning whether we need a building. Perhaps we don't need a hospital there. Perhaps we need expanded clinic services in mobile vans going around poor neighborhoods. And she really ruffled the feathers of many people in the architecture department who wanted to build buildings. Why are you questioning that we're building buildings? She brought Russ in to teach social factors, Galen Kranz, and brought me into, I was already teaching in landscape, into a half-time position in architecture, and received an NIMH grant where we looked at social factors in design and produced a huge report. God knows whatever happened to it, but she was a great influence and inspiration to us.
Roz was, I think, the first woman professor of architecture. A tremendous achievement.
That's right.
And her daughter is here today,
yeah,
which I'm pleased to know.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Roz was heart and common sense and love. And I miss her greatly. She was a great mentor to crazy me, kind of like a second mom. I miss her.
Well, open it up between the three of you.
Ask us a question.
Okay, well, let's go to questions.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe there are questions.
Yes.
Well, this won't be the most significant question. It's just a sideline to something that might
You have to speak really loudly.
Louder. This is just a sideline to something that Mike Teets mentioned, talking about how the general plan process is still sort of adjudicated by the city council, but you're forgetting there's another force now involved in current planning, and that's the electorate. The same way we have at the state level, cities are now holding special elections to vote on developments directly. So again, when you're talking about corporate capitalism having a role in planning, we now see this is being taken down to the local planning level. So I don't know if you have a comment about that.
I think Fred probably should answer this question, but my guess is that Jack would be in two minds about that. He believed enormously in representative government. I think that he had some suspicion that things could go off the rails, which they do from time to time. Certainly at the state level, we haven't done too well with the initiative process. But on the other hand, I think he believed in democracy. And one of his objections to the Planning Commission was that in a deep sense, it violated that. Fred, do you want to comment?
Number one, I think you're absolutely right in talking about Jack would basically say he likes the give and take of a politically accountable process which council provided, distrusted Planning Commission alone, but absolutely distrusted the plebiscite of kind of the initiative and straight voting, because you can get the full debate of issues. He thought that you actually got to the council, and I think you anticipate accurately how he actually responded.
Fred Calignan, why did you make such a deep dive into local government?
Because a guy named Jack Kent took me to lunch one day and said, "What's your background?" Discovered that I was actually came from a political family, much more interested in making change than being an academic, and hooked me, because I had no idea actually even what a planner really did when I got hired as a planner at Cal, except that I'd been doing it for 10 years, but didn't know enough to call it planning.
Great, yeah. Yes. All you students of the environment out there, what questions do you have for our knowledgeable panel?
I'm Bruce Applewood, a doctoral candidate in the city planning department.
Can you get a mic to him, please?
And the question I have,
And
I want some reflection. This might be really, I think this is a good forum for this question. As I've gone to other planning departments around the country and looked at the architecture schools and the design schools, the one thing that I keep really appreciating about the College of Environmental Design is that it's actually called the College of Environmental Design. It's not the College of Architecture. It's not the College of Architecture, it's the College of Environmental Design, and that there was a really brilliant intention to bring on even level both landscape architecture, city planning, and architecture. That sometimes I've found in other schools that planning departments are either sort of a poor cousin of the architecture school, or that they're separate altogether. They might be have more of a public policy focus without a spatial design focus. I think that it's really important about this school that we have this, we're all in this together on the same floor, and there's a lot of interaction between architects, landscape architects, environmental planners, and city regional planners. That has been what I can see from my experiences here as a master's student and now as a doctoral student, one of the strongest things we have going, and I'm really very interested to know about how that was thought of in the beginning, and how and maybe if you can reflect on how that has sort of evolved throughout the decades, and also even to reflect whether or not we're actually achieving the best possible interaction between these three disciplines, which I think is so important to us.
I can say as a student, before we moved into this building, I think we were already a college, I can't remember, but there was very little interaction between the departments, even though city and regional planning was in the old naval architecture, which is still there, thankfully, beautiful building, and next door was architecture and was what was known as the ARC, which is now the Department of Journalism, and landscape was way off in agriculture. We never knew about them, and even between architecture and city planning, I don't think there was much interaction that I remember. Coming into this building was like eye-opening. We were all here, we were all on the department chairs, and heads were all on the same floor. But, and I have to say, as a student and then a faculty member, there was still a disappointing lack of connection. There were evening lecture series, and it tended to be the architects all came to the architecture series, and the landscape architects came to the landscape series, and not so many jointly taught classes. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that I feel it was fairly bunkered. Jack Dykeman, when he was head of planning, and he was also head of the Arthur D. Little office, and I worked for him in that capacity, but I didn't feel, particularly with CRP, I felt there wasn't a lot of connection. Later on, personally, I developed a lot of relations and taught in landscape architecture, site planning course, and then actually the most interaction I think I ever had is Gary Brown, when he's chairman of architecture, was in my professional office, and he said, "Oh, whose watercolors are these?" I said, "Oh, they're mine. I've been doing those all my life." He said, "Well, maybe we should start teaching watercolor class again." So I did that. It was a real gift. I did that for about 12 years. And what it was, it was I was going to say, it was getting off the campus. I choose about 10, we had a bus. I chose about 10 or 12 places, my favorite kind of places in the larger Bay Area. And the one rule was, we'd go there was no talking. So, and actually the feedback I've gotten in my teaching was that class changed more people's lives just by, getting them just out of their heads and into their whole being, because for me, watercolor is just kind of just a meditation. So, and that connection there with landscape was very strong.
I just have to tell one little story, since Bruce Appleyard made the comment and question. Of course, his father was Donald Appleyard, and if you go out and see the San Francisco model, originally there was this giant machine that Donald constructed in order to create simulations of environments, essentially. It was quite wondrous. I remember seeing it at the time, and it intrigued us a lot. It was kind of high-tech of the day and amazing. But more importantly, I want to mention a faculty meeting, I don't know which year. And we all trooped in, and I think Jack must have been in the chair. And the question was to hire a person in urban design. We had a position. And the debate went round. Oh, this is, as usual, Mel Weber put forward the candidates. And that may or may not be actually accurate, but if it's not accurate, it should be, because it's the truth. And there was Roger Montgomery, you know, architect, designer, advocate, public housing. And then on the other hand, there's Appleyard, coming out of the new environmental tradition at Harvard. Clearly a researcher of the first order. And what did we do? How did we make our choice? Well, these were those days. We hired both of them. And we split the appointments so that Donald was half in landscape and Roger was half in architecture. And I think that says a lot about what was really going on at the time.
That's great. I'll call on you just a second. But your Weber story, I couldn't find it in Aristotle if you asked me, but evidently he says, what I say may not be true, but something very like it is. That's the result you say. Yes.
My name is Wendy Sarkissian, and I live in Australia. And in the late 70s, I taught here when Claire was on sabbatical, and then worked with Ray Lifshay. Hi. And I want to remember Marianne Heiserman. She was a graduate in architecture, a wheelchair user. She died tragically at age 49. I think she was the first profoundly disabled person, if you could use that term correctly, to become a registered architect in California. And with Ray's support, and certainly Marianne's uncompromisingly feisty commitment, design for people with disabilities and accessible design generally was really on the agenda in this campus. For me, 2 years in this environment, that was the most powerful thing. And she did go on to work for many years in the campus administration on the accessibility of campus buildings on this campus. That was a culture that supported really radical educational innovations in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think we have to remember this one woman who just stood up for all manner of accessibility, and we nourished her in this college.
Thank you. Where's the gentleman from Folsom, the muralist? Are you here? Oh, there are two of you. When did you, what's your name? When did you finish here? When did you graduate from this place? In 66.
Mid-66.
You told me a great story outside. You have done landmarks. Would you just tell us very quickly what you do and what you got out of this place?
Well,
sorry to put you on the spot, but you can handle it, I'm sure.
No, I'd be glad to do. I set little goals. One of them was to build things without any plans, and I finally reached that goal, which was sort of in the landscape. That meant I had a truck, and I designed in the nursery basically, and things like that. And then I got into muralism, painting actually before that, and I had this being in the landscape department, and we had our magazine was called Landmark. And I thought, oh man, you know, that's something I really would like to do. And I have achieved that through a series of unexpecteds. It was the main landmark piece that I did was going to be a retaining wall, and it got stopped by a landowner. And so it wound up being in a 100-foot long wall that I made the forms for, in fact, so it's a bas-relief as well, and it's all concrete poured just for this mural in the middle of a park that you can see it from a long ways off. And you know, so it's clearly a landmark. Everybody in suburban Sacramento, this is in Carmichael, is well aware of it. And so anyway, I was pleased with having, and then there's another one in Fair Oaks where I live.
Right. And what you told me was that they, Sam, it kind of relates to what all of you said. They saved it from, once they'd saved it, then some rich people wanted to build their houses on this land. So then they bought the land. They started with cookie bake sales and so forth. And then people started kicking in money. And what his life is about going down with his shovel and getting rid of dead brush. The man is married to his creation, and he's very explicit about having gotten started in this environment, and is explicit about attributing his interests and his freedom to roam from being here. And I just came into this room inspired by talking to you out front. And thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Yeah.
What advice do you have or thoughts for integrating social equity into today's climate change concerns in the Berkeley tradition?
Well, yeah, actually, it's be the change you want to see. I picked up, there are no architecture magazines anymore, serious ones. But Metropolis is probably the best of what's around. And I picked it up this month. And there's an article about, Harrison, maybe you know, a young Asian woman from Marin who graduated from here about 3-4 years ago. And she started something called Project H, which now is this virus, this healthy virus that's spreading all over. Do you know about that, Jennifer? Oh. What her thing is just doing humanitarian, she's organized, I mean, these chapters are just self-organizing now. I guess, the web is positive in that way. And it's mostly about doing projects that have some humanitarian value around the world, whether it was redesigning a plastic roll, like a lawn roller, but it's filled with water. So instead of people, having to get, who have to go get their water out of a stream every day, instead of carrying it on their heads and so on, they got this thing they can pull, but they redesigned it so that it's in 2 halves and it can be shipped, and so the cost was and they're just doing all kinds of just local projects. But is that going to solve the problem with social equity? No. But is it, I mean, I was just tremendously heartened. Okay, here's someone who graduated from here, who just started doing this stuff, and she's from what I read, she's just the person just doing it. And no ego involved, no, look at me, blah, blah, blah. No, that doesn't solve social equity. I mean, the problem with solving social equity is related to the problem of just rebuilding our whole system. I mean, capitalism.
Oh, that.
Yeah, I mean, my proposal was, why, as a piece of conceptual art, why don't we get reclaimed wood? Some artists, maybe you guys, reclaimed wood and build stocks, old-fashioned stocks, where they put people for punishment, and up and down Wall Street. And public because no one's ever going to go to jail for this. Just take their $100 million bonuses and, sorry. And public humiliation of this whole class of people who, have destroyed our economy temporarily, at least.
No, you'll teach the first course in that.
Claire, did you want to? No, you got to build it. I think this is a great question, actually, and I'm happy to see that it's one of our distinguished alumni asking it. I'm sorry, I've just blanked. Right. My daughter works in Congress. She's an attorney in Henry Waxman's establishment, and it was one of the 3 people who wrote the recent climate bill. Of course, she didn't write it. They stitched together enormous amounts of stuff from other drafts and other people and other entities and all the rest of it in that sausage machine. But when you asked the question, I thought immediately about that, because the most important thing for equity is not what we do here, although we should be always concerned about it. The impacts of legislation addressing climate change here are likely to be quite small, at least if you believe Paul Krugman, economically. And Krugman's not a bad source. He's not perfect. However, around the world, they're huge. And what we should be doing as planners and environmental designers is to work on global equity in the process of addressing climate change as much as we work on the direct issue of reducing carbon emissions.
Do you have any ideas about how to do that?
What?
What's the strategy?
Well, the first thing we've got to do is have a climate bill before the Copenhagen meeting, and we probably are not going to get it, and that's going to really screw everything up a lot. Where we go from there, God help us.
Yes, in the back. No. Okay, not in the back. Okay.
I just wanted to ask if you have any advice for students that are really interested in this deep ecological design, this whole daunting field, because obviously there's a lot of change that needs to happen, and like where do we start? What do we do? I'm very interested in this field, and I just kind of wonder if you have any advice.
And the field you're asking about is design in general?
Yeah, deep ecological design, deep green design, environmental design.
Okay.
I thought of, I get asked that a lot, get a lot of emails, and I thought about it quite a bit. And I think what you need to do is toss away all the maps and find a space within yourself. Find a new space within yourself. Because right now there are no clear paths. There are so many clear paths. And I think I don't think so. None of the templates we have right now, I think, can really meet your academic templates, can meet your needs. I spent last night with a friends in Berkeley, and we're talking about the same thing, and her two sons who have the same interests. One is working on a farm. It's actually the farm that supplies, one of the main farms that supplies Chez Panisse. The other one is a cook. Cooks don't get, but he goes to Europe and works in various restaurants, learns how to do all kinds of artisanal activities. Though it doesn't answer your question, but I just think there just are so many paths, and I think you just have to find your own way.
You're not telling them not to go to school.
Yeah, I don't think
I thought that you might be saying that, actually.
I think that just going to school continuously is, I don't think it's very healthy. I think it's part of the problems of our system.
So, turn on, tune in, drop out.
I recommend you seek out and take a workshop with Joanna Macy, deep ecologist and inspired Buddhist teacher. She's a neighbor and friend of mine over here in Berkeley in the Elmwood. And she teaches, among many other things, a wonderful workshop called the Council for All Beings, in which the participant, this is completely different than anything you'll receive in CED, in which the participants take on the roles of sentient beings and how they're being treated today on the planet. It is mind-boggling and soul-changing. So look up the books and workshops of Joanna Macy, M-A-C-Y.
Michael, do you want to have a comment on this? And then we're going to finish with a final comment from each of you. Oh, you think so? Okay, all right. Yes.
There's several.
Yes, over here. Yes.
I came to this school in a period of great activism, and as a student, and I have been involved with the school ever since as a lecturer and so on. This is not a period where one feels that activism is really a driving force, and I completely do not understand why. If ever there was a moment where the CED should be leading on this campus, it's now. And you can't teach activism, you can't make people be activists, but what can the school do?
to encourage people to feel the way that student just felt, that there's a burning need here. What do I do? How can the school move forward in the next 50 years to provide a place where people can feel those things and can feel they can act?
Teach courses like the one Sim described. I didn't take it, but I remember people who did, where they went out in the country and they built houses for themselves and learned to live off the land. And we should be having more things like that, getting people out of Worcester Hall. I got students out of Worcester Hall at the same time he got them to Inverness. I got them over to a beach. They also couldn't speak, and they had to build houses for each other made out of flotsam and jetsam. And they knew a lot about each other, having written the environmental autobiography, and then they reflected on whether this person had built a house for them or a house for themselves. It was a very enlightening experience. We, as teachers, I think we need to get out of this building. Sorry to those of you who teach in this building, and I did most of my life, and get out into the real environment and teach cities, beaches, nature, and do something different. Be creative in how we teach.
Looking historically, if you will, for a moment, it seems to me that every time has the activism that's appropriate for it, or doesn't, as the case may be, and that too, in a certain sense, is appropriate. And maybe Peter later will speak on historical inevitability. I puzzle about this question because to me, it's not clear what kind of activism works now. It's clear there is a lot of activism at work, and it's doing good stuff, and it's smaller scale, a lot of it. What I don't see is an activism that's thinking in terms of large efforts, of large changes. If you like, visionaries like Sim really questioning what the structure is that we have now. People don't seem to be very interested in doing that. And if they do, they're tending to fall back on 19th century solutions, socialism or other isms, whatever they might be. I don't have the answer to your question at all, but it seems to me we must look for the answer in the time that we're living and ask what kind of activism is important. And I think my previous comment suggests some of that we should be activists toward the big issues as well as the small issues, and recognize what we've learned out of environmental design, that the two are really very tightly connected.
I want to have a stop there. We're out of our time, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to exist as an opinion holder here on the last question. I wandered away from Worcester to university administration and made my way through that work, surviving on little aphorisms that I would make up, like, nothing gets done unless somebody does it, you know. That's really important. And, but the other one is, for those of you of a certain age, an ounce of position is worth a pound of policy. I'm thinking of the sausage machine right now and the scale at which things get done. And we need visionaries going to places they don't ordinarily go and taking ideas they don't ordinarily take. But we need people at every level doing all the work. All right, thank you very much.